Live from New Delhi, you're watching DD India Global. We'll get you top stories from India and the region. I am Tanvi Taneja, and for news from the rest of the world, I'm joined by my colleague in Washington, D.C., Jagrati Dave. Hi, Jagrati.
Hi Tanvi, it's 10 a.m. here in Washington DC, 3 in the afternoon across Central Europe. Coming up in the next 30 minutes, Israel's leader Benjamin Netanyahu will be greeted by protesters and a divided Congress when he addresses lawmakers later today, and find out why Ukraine's foreign minister is visiting China. We're joined by our correspondents from around the world. But first, the headlines.
Israeli Prime Minister Benjamin Netanyahu to address the U.S. Congress today to meet separately with President Joe Biden, Vice President Kamala Harris on Thursday, and Republican presidential nominee Donald Trump on Friday. Kenyan President William Ruto names opposition members in new cabinet in response to grievances of young protesters. British Foreign Secretary David Lammy begins his two-day visit to India to meet Indian leaders for a reset of UK-India partnership. And the United Nations warns that eliminating global hunger by 2030 looks increasingly impossible to achieve, as people suffering from chronic hunger remain almost the same over the past year. Up first, news from Africa. Kenyan President William Ruto on Wednesday nominated 4 members of the main opposition party to a new broad-based cabinet that he promised in response to nationwide protests. The opposition members, including the pick to lead the finance ministry, John Mbadi Nogongo, are allies of opposition leader Raila Odinga, whom Ruto defeated in the 2022 election. Kenyan President William Ruto said that he would be proposing amendments to the anti-corruption and public procurement laws.
I will be proposing amendments to the Evidence Act and the Criminal Procedure Code, among other necessary legislative amendments to all statutes relating to corruption, to expedite investigations and prosecution of corruption and economic crimes cases, and provide for their conclusion within 6 months.
Earlier on Tuesday, Kenya's police fired tear gas to prevent scuffles between groups of protesters and government supporters in the capital, Nairobi, as youth-led demonstrations against alleged corruption and misgovernance dragged into the 6th week.
President Ruto has nominated 10 people to form his new cabinet. These include 4 members of the opposition. The officials will take up positions in the Treasury, Energy, Mining and Cooperatives ministries. The latest nominees form part of a list of 11 named last week. The nominations must be approved by Parliament. President Ruto's decision to make changes and back down from a proposed tax hikes of $2.7 billion was prompted by demonstrations led by young Kenyans demanding for reforms in his government. The protests that started in June have seen more than 50 people lose their lives. Leon Senyange reporting from Kampala, Uganda for DD India.
On to the Israel-Hamas conflict now. Israeli forces carried out new raids in the Gaza Strip on Wednesday, hours before Prime Minister Benjamin Netanyahu is due to address the U.S. Congress. Israeli military, which is trying to eradicate the Islamist militant group Hamas after the October 7th attack on Israel, said that it had been operating in areas from which fighters had been able to fire rockets into Israel and attack Israeli troops. Israeli forces also carried out airstrikes on several areas of central and northern Gaza Strip. Israel said that its action was intended to prevent Hamas fighters from regrouping. Meanwhile, an Israeli negotiation team is due to resume talks, ceasefire talks on Thursday that would include hostages being released in return for Palestinian prisoners held in Israeli jails. Israel informed Egypt that an Israeli delegation would arrive in Cairo on Wednesday evening local time. Israeli Prime Minister Benjamin Netanyahu is in the United States of America. He will address the U.S. lawmakers in Washington, D.C. later today. This amid growing pressure to end the Gaza conflict on him. My colleague Jagriti Dave is in the U.S. Capitol. She gives us more on this and other stories making the headlines around the world. Jagriti, a tight trip for Netanyahu?
Yes, Israeli Prime Minister Benjamin Netanyahu will address congressional lawmakers here in Washington later, at a time when both US and Israeli politics are going through tough times. The Israeli leader will speak to a joint session of the Senate and House of Representatives, surpassing British wartime leader Winston Churchill, who did it 3 times. Netanyahu landed in Washington on Monday, the day after President Biden announced he was quitting the 2024 presidential race, and he endorsed Vice President Harris as his successor. Harris has been careful not to publicly diverge from Biden's support for Israel. Netanyahu's speech before Congress comes in response to an invitation initially extended by House Speaker Mike Johnson. Now, US President Joe Biden will also host Israeli Prime Minister Benjamin Netanyahu at the White House on Thursday to discuss progress towards a ceasefire in Gaza, the release of hostages as well. Vice President Kamala Harris will meet Mr. Netanyahu separately. For more on the upcoming speech, let's speak to our correspondent Sally Patterson, who's been tracking developments from New York. Hi, Sally. What are we expecting to hear from the Israeli Prime Minister?
Well, Jagriti, as you said there, a rather underwhelming arrival for Israeli Prime Minister Benjamin Netanyahu when he landed in the United States on Monday. Indeed, that arrival was really overshadowed by that bombshell announcement from President Joe Biden that he will not be rerunning in November. He instead handed the reins over to Vice President Kamala Harris instead. But Netanyahu is hoping to use the opportunity later on Wednesday to really gain that momentum back, get that support from US lawmakers who he really needs on his side in order to drive that war forward in Gaza. On the plane over, he wore a hat that said total victory, which really leads into this argument about wanting to completely destroy Hamas in Gaza and surrounding territories as well. Now, what we're expecting from that address is twofold. Ongoing discussions about those negotiations, which you just heard, are continuing to take place in Qatar, and also the release of the Israeli hostages still being held in Gaza, more than 100 of them still believed to be held in underground locations there. We heard a readout from the White House earlier, which said that in that discussion and then in later talks between President Joe Biden and Prime Minister Netanyahu, we're expecting to hear discussions about the United States' ironclad commitment to Israel's security, including countering Iran's threats to Israel and the broader region. Now, crucially, Vice President Kamala Harris will not be in that address later on. She is sticking to prior plans in the state of Indiana instead.
And Sally, there's been some criticism around the visit as well. Tell us about that.
Well, the Israeli Prime Minister is really getting it on both sides. He's getting a wave of criticism, firstly from Israelis who continue to have their family members held inside Gaza. They are demanding a release of those hostages immediately and saying that should be the priority for the Israeli government after many months of war and many months of their family members being kept in really dire conditions inside the Strip. Then there's also considerable criticism from both abroad and at home of people who say that the war has gone on long enough. More than 39,000 Palestinians are believed to have died, according to Hamas figures. And there continues to be a humanitarian crisis among the Strip, with lack of food, water and access to sanitation facilities as well. And lawmakers saying that that is unacceptable. There are a growing number of Democrats in particular who have said they will not be attending that address in Congress. In fact, some of them saying that Netanyahu shouldn't have been invited to speak in the first place. However, there's also criticism of those who aren't going to be there, especially from Republican lawmakers who say it's so important now for America to be supporting its very strong ally. There's criticism that Kamala Harris will not be at that address, with one lawmaker calling it petty and disgraceful. We're not so far away now from November's election, and both the Republicans and the Democrats are going to have to really balance a very fine line here when it comes to gaining support of those at home on the left and the right, who have very different views when it comes to the situation thousands of miles away in Gaza. Jagruti.
Thank you for that update, Sally. That was Sally Patterson reporting from New York. Now, Russia has accused European leaders of trying to frighten people with what it says are fabricated fears about threats Russia and China pose to the continent. European leaders have repeatedly warned that Moscow could expand its military operation in Ukraine to countries in Europe. Allegations Russia denies. Meanwhile, Moscow has also said that France's refusal to accredit some Russian journalists to cover the Paris Olympics on security grounds is a sign of paranoia. Meanwhile, Ukraine's Foreign Minister Dmytro Kuleba is in China this week. On Tuesday, he met with China's Foreign Minister Wang Yi, and the two discussed ways to achieve a so-called fair peace in the war with Ukraine. Kuleba's visit is the first by a high-ranking Ukrainian official since Russia's full-scale February 2022 invasion. But many Western nations have previously criticized China, the world's second-largest economy, for not publicly condemning the war. Staying in Europe, and the UK and Germany have signed a joint defence declaration in Germany's capital, Berlin. The two nations pledged to work more closely to strengthen their defence industries, reinforce European security and support Ukraine in its fight to push back Russian forces. The UK's new Defence Minister John Healey signed the pact with his German counterpart Boris Pistorius. Healey's visit is part of a two-day trip that includes stops in France, Poland and Estonia, as he sets out the new Labour government's commitment to deepen defence ties with allies in the European Union. Now, a court in Berlin has ruled that Germany must improve its air quality standards in order to meet European pollution targets. The court ruled in favour of a leading environmental group that has sued the German government. This is one of a flurry of recent suits by activists and environmental organisations against the government's climate policies. Meanwhile, flights have resumed at one of Germany's main regional airports after climate activists had halted air traffic for several hours. Police said members of the last generation group of climate activists had glued themselves to the runway of Cologne-Bonn Airport. Now, a UN report says the goal to eliminate global hunger by 2030 looks increasingly impossible to achieve, with the number of people suffering chronic hunger barely changing over the past year. It further said that around 733 million people faced hunger in 2023. That's 1 in 11 people globally and 1 in 5 in Africa, as conflict, climate change and economic crises took their toll. And that's it from me here in Washington. Back to you in the studio, Tanvi.
Thank you, Jagruti. Jagruti Dave joining us from Washington, D.C. You're watching DD India Global, still to come on the show. Typhoon Gaemi strengthens as it nears Taiwan. 2 people reported dead, over 200 injured. And ASEAN seeks to tackle the Myanmar crisis tensions in the South China Sea as ministers meet in Laos.
This week on Defence Dynamics, we dive into the turbulent waters of Indian Ocean, where shifting alliances and growing rivalries are redefining the security landscape. Discover how India's announcement to upgrade its military bases on Lakshadweep Island is poised to counter the nexus between China, Pakistan and now the Maldives. And also how the simmering instability in India's neighborhood, that is Pakistan and Bangladesh, could have a wider impact on the security dynamics of the whole region. Do tune in for strategic insights that will guide India's geopolitics in days ahead on a special episode on DD India, Wednesday at 8:30 p.m. IST.
Welcome back. You're watching DD India Global. I'm Tanvi Taneja. Typhoon Gaime is strengthening as it is set to make landfall on the northeastern coast of Taiwan on Wednesday evening local time. The storm has intensified seasonal monsoon rains in the Philippines, causing landslides and flooding over the past few days. Residents on Wednesday grappled with torrential rains as Typhoon Gaime inundated several parts of the Philippines' capital Manila and nearby provinces. At least 12 people have died and more than 600,000 are displaced due to the storm. Flights have been delayed while markets are shut in Taiwan. Taiwan's military remains on standby amid torrential rains, and thousands of soldiers have been deployed for rescue efforts. Now, in Nepal, at least 18 people were killed after a Saurya Airlines plane crashed at the Tribhuvan International Airport in Kathmandu on Wednesday. A press statement issued by the Civil Aviation Authority of Nepal said that the Saurya Airlines domestic plane, which was scheduled to head to the resort town of Pokhara, took off at 11:11 in the morning from Kathmandu Airport and turned right, but crashed moments later in the eastern section of the airport. The crash occurred after the flight suffered a runway excursion during takeoff. The plane was carrying crew members and technicians to Pokhara for maintenance works. Domestic flights have been affected as the airport is temporarily shut. Staying in Asia, British Foreign Secretary David Lammy is holding talks with India's External Affairs Minister Dr. S. Jaishankar. Lammy is on a two-day visit to India. It is the first high-level visit by a British minister to India after the installation of a Labour government in the UK. The British High Commission in New Delhi said that the visit will push for a reset of the UK-India partnership by reinforcing UK's commitment to securing a bilateral free trade agreement between the two sides. ASEAN foreign ministers meeting kicked off in Laos on Wednesday. 10 Southeast Asian delegates and foreign ministers are participating in ASEAN's community building efforts and reaffirming ASEAN's centrality and unity amidst current geopolitical developments. Alongside India's External Affairs Minister Dr. S. Jaishankar, China's Foreign Minister Wang Yi will be in attendance at the meetings starting on 25th July. Heavy police and armed security presence was seen ahead of the arrivals of foreign ministers and senior officials for the meetings. So, India's External Affairs Minister Dr. S. Jaishankar will make back-to-back visits to Laos and Japan to attend the meetings related to ASEAN and Quad. The minister will travel to Vientiane, capital of Laos, from 25th to 27 July to participate in the foreign ministers' meetings under the ASEAN framework. This includes ASEAN-India, East Asia Summit and ASEAN Regional Forum meetings. 2024 marks a decade of India's Act East policy, which was announced at the 9th East Asia Summit in 2014. Dr. Jaishankar will then travel to Japan from 28th to 30th of July to participate in a meeting of the Quad foreign ministers in Tokyo on the 29th, along with his counterparts from Australia, Japan and the US. Tanzania's Speaker and Interparliamentary Union's President Tulia Ackson called on India's President Draupadi Murmu at the Rashtrapati Bhavan, India's President House in New Delhi on Wednesday. President Murmu expressed confidence that as IPU President Dr. Axon will further strengthen understanding and dialogue among member countries and use the forum as a platform to discuss issues of relevance for the global south. And some news from India now. Union Minister of State for Environment, Forest and Climate Change, Kirtivardhan Singh, interacted with participants of the 75th Know India program in New Delhi on Wednesday. The minister shared his insights on economic transformation under the leadership of Prime Minister Narendra Modi. He encouraged participants to contribute to the vision of a developed India, Viksit Bharat. The Indian Council of Medical Research team visited the Nipah cell of Medical College, Manchuri Medical College in India's southern Malappuram and Pandikad area, where a boy died due to the virus. After the visit, the team held a meeting and expressed satisfaction at the steps taken by Kerala to prevent the spread of Nipah virus there. And we now take a look at other stories making news around the world. Alexandria's Mediterranean coast in Egypt is blanketed by overlapping umbrellas as thousands of Egyptians flock to the city's public beaches, escaping this summer's extreme heat waves. This comes amid a dwindling number of accessible public beaches in Alexandria. In a photography project and homage to the world-famous musician Prince Rogers Nelson, a Seattle artist Troy Gua created more than thousands of miniature sets of Prince dolls and outfits to mark the 40th anniversary of Nelson's first movie.
No, it's actually not in here. Or wait.
India's Unified Payments Interface has expanded into Europe. On February 2, 2024, UPI partnered with the French digital payment platform Lyra, enabling Indian tourists to use the UPI at the Eiffel Tower. This initiative is particularly beneficial during the Paris Olympic Games, offering Indian tourists a familiar and efficient payment method abroad. More in this exclusive report by our correspondent in Paris, Narayan Singh.
India's Unified Payments Interface, or the UPI, has extended its reach into Europe, marking a significant step towards India's Prime Minister Narendra Modi's vision of globalizing UPI. This year, on the 2nd of February, UPI collaborated with French digital payment platform Lyra to enable seamless and convenient payment experiences for Indian tourists in Europe. This monumental step was highlighted at the Eiffel Tower, one of the world's most iconic landmarks. Indian tourists visiting Paris have been booking their trips to the Eiffel Tower using UPI for the last 6 months, simplifying the payment process and enhancing their travel experience.
UPI is going really good, like it's an initiation, so at tourist sites it's working. Gallery Lafayette for some shopping purposes is working, at tourist sites for taking tickets at Eiffel Tower it's working, and I think it's a very good initiative because we can probably pay as an Indian from like way easily compared to what we could have done before with some traveler's check or some tourist debit cards. So it's way easier, and I think it saves costs as well.
As we know, UPI payments are available in Europe or Paris especially, and now it is easier to get the tickets for Eiffel Tower and attractions using UPI, so it is really helpful for us Indians, and it will make much more easier for tourists when they come to Europe or Paris or anywhere in Europe. So this will be really helpful if we have it everywhere.
Further solidifying UPI's presence in France, the platform went live on the 3rd of July at the flagship store of the renowned Galeries Lafayette in Haussmann, Paris. This edition provides Indian shoppers with a seamless digital payment option, reflecting the growing acceptance of UPI in global markets.
I believe that UPI is a big success for India, and it is working really great for Indian tourists in Paris. Like we know that it has been installed at 2 places, at Galerie Lafayette and at Eiffel Tower. So it is really benefiting. It is convenient for the Indian tourists, and it saves a lot of time.
This initiative is particularly beneficial during the Paris Olympic Games, offering Indian tourists a familiar an efficient payment method abroad. Prime Minister Narendra Modi's vision of a digital India is not only transforming domestic landscapes but is also making significant strides internationally.
The rollout of UPI in Europe reflected India's growing influence in the global digital payment landscape. By providing a reliable and user-friendly payment system, UPI became an indispensable tool for Indian tourists, ensuring they could focus on enjoying sights and sounds of Paris without worrying about financial transactions. Naran Singh's report for DD India, Paris.
And London's Victoria and Albert Museum made headlines when a job ad went live on their website looking for superfan advisors to be on hand for all things Taylor Swift. This was for their exhibition titled Taylor Swift Songbook Trail. This exhibition showcases outfits worn by the 14-time Grammy Award-winning artist. It features costumes and accessories from Taylor's own personal archive, which retrace the iconic singer's career. For all things Taylor Swift has worn and shown in her career, illustrious career. That's all for this edition of DD India Global. Do let us know your thoughts on the news of the day. Connect with us on our different social media handles, Instagram, X, Facebook at DD India Live. And for those on the go, you can catch all the latest news and updates on our DD India mobile app. The app is available on both Android and iOS platforms. You can scan the QR code on the screen to download now. So we will be back with more news as it breaks here on DD India. I am Tanvi Taneja from my entire team here in New Delhi and elsewhere in the world. Thank you for watching DD India Global. Namaskar.